It's been a long 2 years for some people, hasn't it? Perhaps for most people. I mean, there have been all sorts of events these last 2 years, all sorts of added stress and strain and confusion at all sorts of levels, all sorts of challenges and changes and uncertainty, and lots of false starts too. I mean, hopes that this COVID thing would be done by now, and then not. And the rest of you, like I am, tired of learning a new letter of the Greek alphabet paired with the word variant? Yeah. So what's the way through this? In this year's Christmas message, I talked about how you find hope not in the things of the season, not in the change of circumstances, not in the stuff of Christmas, but in the person of Jesus. Well, the way to find joy is in the same place. Ultimately, it's in the person of Jesus. But here's the rubber meets the road question for today, and actually for these times that we're living in. Can joy be found in the journey, even when the road's still long and the way's still dark? We're going to look at the story of the wise men to get some answers for that. You'll find that in, if you want to follow along on your devices, in Matthew chapter 2.
Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you, who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too." After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod.
So here's the first thing I notice from the story of the wise men as far as steps to finding joy. Step number one, see or at least sense that God is for you. See or sense that God is for you. Now, we don't know a whole lot about the wise men, really. We certainly, well, you have some clues, both from the Bible and from sources outside the Bible. The word that's translated wise men hints that they were at least religious or spiritual people, but they're sort of mysterious. Now, here's what we do kind of know. The wise men were from the east, which means they were Gentiles. They probably had some knowledge of God and the Bible, but they probably had all sorts of different religious practices and dabbled in all sorts of gods and spiritual things. And they probably weren't believers in the one true God at this point. And since Jews didn't really have much or anything to do with Gentiles, these wise men probably had no sense or feeling that this God of the Jews was for them. But he was. And they started to see that, or at least to sense that, when they saw the star. All right? The star appeared to them. The Jews wanted little or nothing to do with the Gentiles, but apparently the God of the Jews did. And so he sent a star to them. And you know, that's an important truth. That's one of the first steps into joy. Seeing that this God, the true God, is for everyone. Right? He doesn't tell people no based on race or class or language or skin color. He doesn't exclude people because of how bad you are or how good you are. He loves all people and wants all people to be in a relationship with him, no matter what the past story or the present one, no matter how messy your stuff is, no matter even what you think about him at the moment. Remember, these wise men probably aren't even believers at this point, but when they saw the star, they saw or at least sensed that this God was for them too. That he was for them, and so they were drawn by this special star to come and to see what this God was up to. And so they started taking those first steps into greater joy. Joy in seeing that God was for them, and also joy in the promise of something special, even though they hadn't seen it yet. Now, I want you to just stop and think about something for a minute before we move on to the next point. How have you seen or sensed that God is for you? How have you seen or sensed that God is for you? And also, what special promises of God give you joy even before you get where you're going? The journey toward greater joy, right? It starts, the first step is seeing that God's for you, no matter what your backstory is. And then it grows as you focus on the promise of something special. But it's a long road, isn't it? And sometimes the road's really hard. For these wise men, the road was at least a couple of months long and could have been as much as a year or more. But apparently, there's no grumbling about the distance or the expense or the effort, at least none that we read about. Now, I'm sure if there were logbooks, or if the NSA is somehow listening in on their cell phones, or if there is some flight data recorder sort of black box thing, that I'm sure we're going to hear about some ups and downs in those things. There might even been a little bit of grumbling now and then, because, I mean, it was a long journey, right? And it cost a lot. And they traveled over some rather inhospitable territory in some pretty long, dark nights, which, you know, if you think about that sort of journey, it seems to me like a pretty good metaphor for where we've been living for the past 2 years. But here's the deal. They kept going. They kept going, and more than that, when they showed up in Jerusalem, they were still filled with joy. Now, why is that? In a word, attitude. Attitude. See, while the road wasn't easy, what they saw was that each day was a step closer to what? To who that they were looking for. And after getting to Jerusalem and meeting with Herod, their joy even ramped up a notch. I mean, let me take you back into the text, maybe even several. At verse 9 of chapter 2 in Matthew, it starts this way. After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. Now let me focus you on that last sentence for a minute. Let me read it again. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. Well, why filled with joy when they saw the star? I mean, at this point, they knew they were going to Bethlehem, and was the star really that necessary or important anymore? I mean, these were guys who had come hundreds, maybe thousands of miles, and now Herod had kind of narrowed things down to this small little town not too far away. Did they really need a star to guide them on a well-marked road for about a 2-hour or so walk? And once they got to the town, couldn't they have just knocked on all the doors? It wasn't that big. I mean, did they really need a star to guide them? Perhaps not. But perhaps so. I mean, perhaps these guys instinctively recognized that we always need a little divine assistance if we're really to find God, if we're really to see him for who he is. That we can't, by our own reason or strength, believe in Jesus or come to him. That even in our spiritual seeking, that we need a Holy Spirit guide to show us the way. It's not like, well, thanks God, you've got me this far and I'll take it from here. It's more like, I need you, God, every step of the way. And maybe that's why the text says, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Or a quite literal translation of the text would be more something like this: they rejoiced with an exceedingly great joy. I mean, joy, joy, joy. 3 times, not just one, 3 words for joy when one would have done just fine. I mean, they were really excited. And what the text says is they're really excited on seeing the star again, seeing the sign again. A sign that said, after all this time, after all this long, hard, sometimes exhausting journey, sometimes dark and dreary journey, that God's still here. That God's still here, that he's still leading us, and he's still guiding us, that he's still with us, that he's keeping his promises, that he's bringing us to himself. And guys, I think there's a lesson for us in that. I think another step into finding joy in the journey itself is to do this. I mean, Luke is very specific in telling us that the wise men were overjoyed, not when they heard, oh, go to Bethlehem, but when they saw the star. Which hints to me again that the next step in finding joy in the journey is to keep your eye in the sky. Keep your eye in the sky. Not literally, but what I mean by that is follow the signs. Follow the signs and also find joy in the signs, just like the wise men did, even when the journey is still going on, and even before you arrive at your destination. You see, what the signs do is they remind you when the road is long and dark and tired and exhausting and stressful and strained. They remind you that God's faithful. That God is faithful, and when you see the signs and you hear the promise, you can rejoice even before you see everything. You can have joy because you know that God's word is true. That God always keeps his word and his promises. And so that from God's perspective, what he said, well, it's a done deal. It might not always happen in our timing. I mean, I'm sure the wise men probably would have liked a shorter journey, but it happens in the right time. And when you keep your eyes on the signs, it helps to give you joy in knowing that, yeah, God's going to come through, because he always has and he always will. That's what the wise men found. You know, I think you can find that too. So before we go on, here's what I want you to do in this moment again. Stop and think about that whole idea of signs for a moment. What are the signs that point to you the fact that, well, God's still here, even in these dark of night times? And what can you do to keep your eyes on the signs? You know, there's a lot of people right now, and maybe you're one of them, who find themselves in the same place that the wise men were, needing to find joy in the journey, because we're still on the road, and we're not at our destination yet, and sometimes the road's still a little dark. When it is, Well, the first step into greater joy is, remember, see that God is for you. And then another step in after that is to keep your eye in the sky, to look at those signs and to remember the promises and to find joy in the fact that God keeps his word, that it's always true, that he's always faithful. The third step, and I get this from the wise men's story too, is to actually show up. I mean, they weren't content just to remotely say, hey, Bethlehem's out there somewhere. Glad we made it here. They actually showed up where Jesus was. Show up. I mean, and what I mean by that is find joy in God's presence. Find joy in God's presence even if it's not what you expected it to be. I mean, think about this for a minute. Have you ever been disappointed in an expected experience from God? Have you ever been disappointed, discouraged in something that you think you're getting from God and then you don't, or maybe what you feel you're getting out of church? Most of us have been in that place at one point or another, but not the wise men here. I mean, even though Jesus wasn't what they probably expected, they're still filled with joy. I mean, true, they're expecting a baby, but the rest of the circumstances? Poor, simple, pretty much uneducated parents, humble, simple, rented living quarters, no signs of wealth or power or influence. I doubt very much that that's what they expected to find with this King of the Jews. And yet, as you read this story, there's no signs of a discouragement or disappointment in what they found. Much to the contrary. Let me take you back into the text. Verse 11. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and incense and of myrrh. There's joy and excitement. And the joy there is simply from the fact, not in anything that they're getting, because they're not getting anything. The joy there is being in his presence. Just kind of circle that, type that into your device. You find joy as you show up in the presence of God. I mean, here's the connection. If you want to find joy in the journey, then, like the wise men, make it your goal to show up, right? To get into the presence of God, to be there, period. And not to worry about what you're going to get out of it. And, you know, the wise men, they were actually there to give something, not to get something. But what they found was that God's so good. God is so good and so generous and so gracious that you can't outgive him. And even as you come and give to him, he's gonna fill you up, which is what the wise men was happening with them there. They weren't filled up with stuff. They were filled up with something that I think was even more essential after that long, dark road. They were filled with joy. Filled with joy, even though their journey still wasn't done, because it was still a long, dark way back home again. I mean, what showing up does is it adds to joy in the journey. So that's my encouragement to you. Show up. And make that showing up both and. And here's what I mean by that. Yeah, keep showing up online, because it's convenient and it's comfortable, and you know what? God does show up when you tune in. But I also want to encourage you to understand that you're missing something if that's all that you do. You don't get communion online. And singing online, and it's frankly kind of weak. I mean, there's even all sorts of metrics from huge churches with killer bands that people watching online, they just tune out that band part and they just tune right into the message because it just doesn't feel the same. And people, this connection that you have as the body and seeing people and connecting with other people, That's part of what happens when you show up together. So my encouragement is, besides showing up online, get a booster shot. Get a booster shot to your joy by doing what the wise men did and show up in person. I mean, make the effort to go just a little farther. And no matter where in the country you are that you're watching this right now, I want to encourage you to also find a place to show up in person to worship with other people. And if you happen to be watching this together with other people right now in church this week, then I would encourage you to keep that up, to keep doing that and experiencing this both and presence of God. You know, maybe that's why there was more than one wise man who took this journey. It wasn't just to share the expenses and to help and encourage each other along the way. I think it was also to celebrate when they got there. I mean, there's way much more joy in a party, right, than in a party of one. So again, check out what we see here. Matthew 2, verse 11. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. And then, now this is immediately, no break, no pause, they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and incense and of myrrh. See, there's one more step into joy. When we show up, you know what else we do? We share. We share our worship, and we share our stuff. I mean, that's what I saw the wise men doing here. They gave Jesus their worship, and they gave Jesus their stuff. They gave joyfully, and then they ended up finding joy in giving. And here's why. See, when you look at the text here, you see that they didn't give to get something. They just gave. Freely, generously, willingly. Rare gifts, costly gifts, precious gifts, gifts fit for a king. The best things that they had to give, and not just what they thought that they could get by with. And in sharing and giving generously, they ended up finding even greater joy that day. And I think perhaps it's because they discovered in giving that giving is close to the heart of God. In fact, if you've read God's story, you know it's more than that. Jesus' whole story is giving. Giving freely, giving willingly, giving generously, giving joyfully. I mean, giving up heaven for a time and humbling himself and serving and sacrificing, even to the point of giving his life for us. And that means that giving isn't just close to the heart of God. Giving is the heart of God. And so get this, when you give, God's heart is beating more strongly inside of yours. As one who gives and who tries to give generously, I can tell you that's true. And that it's a good thing. There is real joy in giving, and in giving generously on a whole lot of levels. So here's a challenge for you right now. I want to give you a challenge to just take a look at what you're giving right now. Take a look at what you're giving right now and then do something this month to give just a little more. As you do that, I think what you're going to find is God's going to do something with that. You see, what I found again is one who gives and has grown in giving over time is you just can't outgive God. And whatever I give to him with open hands, well, God gives back and fills up even more. Not always with stuff. Sometimes not with stuff at all. But with things that I need even more than that. Like a peace that passes understanding. And a deep and rich and abiding joy that in this journey of unending, sometimes darkness, is almost like a defiant nevertheless. A joy that says God is still here and that he's with me and that he's for me. I mean, that's a joy that you also receive in giving. And I think if you do that, if you take those steps into joy, if you not only see that God is for you, if you not only keep your eye in the sky or look at the signs, remember the promises, if you not only show up and in that both and way, but if you also share, and by that I mean give, if you do those things, then maybe you'll find a little more joy in your life right now at a time and a place on the road that you really need it.